Welcome to this guest lecture recording. My name is Christian Lamker, and I'm happy to introduce you to Ross Beveridge from the University of Glasgow, who will be talking on the politics of urban polycrisis. The lecture was given on 17th September 2024 at the University of Groningen Faculty of Spatial Sciences as part of my course City Matters, Urban Inequality and Social Justice. Ross gave the lecture together with Philippe Koch, which you can see in another recording. Now sit back and enjoy.
I think that should be enough as an introduction. Ross, we are so happy to have you here with us on this morning on Saukerterrein, with us here in class today, this early afternoon, with this wonderful weather that we have all together organized for both of you. So always remember, whenever you get to Groningen in September, this is how typical Dutch September looks like. So keep that in your mind when you move home afterwards. And now, Ross, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian again, and Marian for the great invitation. Really happy to be here. So my work is, so I think you guys are planners or on a planning course. My work is more around politics and governance of cities. And work I've done recently with Philip has been around thinking about democracy through cities, through urban context. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the lecture. But primarily today I want to talk about this idea of crisis, polycrisis, as something which is impacting cities, and to open up some questions about crisis, which Philip will then go into discuss in detail in the second lecture in relation to housing. So housing being like the ultimate urban crisis, the recurring crisis of housing. Okay, so obviously you may have noticed we live in a period of crisis or multiple crises. Climate crisis, this kind of ticking clock of climate crisis. We have war. We have multiple political crises in lots and lots of places. The rise of the far right, the rise of populism, disengagement from democracy, all these kind of things, these processes have been building, it seems, at least since, say, the global financial crisis, which was really interesting to hear this morning. It was mentioned quite a few times, and yesterday we were in various places around the city, and it came up again that the global financial crisis of 2008-2009 had a massive impact on cities in the Netherlands and planning. Money just stopped. So different kinds of planning policies had to be thought through in this context. But we're thinking more generally, so staying at the big macro level at the moment, there is an increasing idea or discourse emerging that we're in a different period of crisis now. Okay, we've always had crisis. We always encounter a crisis, and Marxists would always argue that capitalism is inherently crisis-driven. There's always a crisis every 20 or 30 years. But what people think is happening now is that we have a form of crisis in which different interlinking and overlapping crises are creating a kind of stasis, so things aren't changing. So one idea that's always been associated with crisis, of course, is harm, risk, emergency, terrible situations endured, but some kind of release. The crisis generates new beginnings. What people are arguing now is that because of the enveloping crises we have, crisis is not creating a release. We're just stuck. We can't get beyond the various crises that we're encountering. So an example might be, we generally all know and accept, well, majority of us do, that there is a climate crisis. What are we doing about it? Not enough. One of the reasons we're not doing enough is because we have a political crisis, increasingly. And as we see far-right governments becoming stronger and stronger with their very strong anti-green rhetoric, we can imagine that a scenario in the next 5 to 10 years in Europe where we might see less action, not more action, to deal with climate crisis. So this is leading to the notion, so this idea that polycrisis, poly meaning multiple, is creating some kind of perma-crisis. So we're in an extended period of crisis where we have to get used to the idea that it won't go away. So this is the notion, whether we accept it or not, that a lot of scholars, thinkers are putting forward today. So, how do we relate? What does that have to do with cities and urbanization, that kind of thing? Well, of course, cities are, to understand cities is to understand that they're always in crisis to a certain extent. There's always some people in cities who experience crisis due to inequalities produced through the economy, produced through politics. We have endemic crises or reoccurring crises, housing. It's not new necessarily. But also within the academic literature, there is a growing sense that the form of urbanization, the form of urbanism and urban policy that we've had has contributed to a particular urban form of crisis, which is also new. And someone mentioned Richard Florida today, the great advocate of the creative class as a way of rejuvenating, regenerating cities, essentially to many people, an apologist for gentrification. He also has written a book recently reflecting back on the influence he has had on this whole debate on how cities should be governed and what kind of politics we had. He's also saying, look, actually, I didn't want this to happen to cities. I didn't want them to become extremely exclusive and gentrified in cities where poor people get pushed out further and further. That's not what I wanted. So he's kind of saying, yeah, we're in this kind of crisis. And, of course, this is getting worse because we have an economy which basically rewards people who have assets already, who have property. So property prices generally keep going up. And people who don't have property, don't have possessions, have to pay higher and higher rents to people who own the assets. And he's saying, well, this is just wrong. We shouldn't be allowing this. So he's also saying that we're in a different kind of urban crisis now. And of course, we've had since the financial crisis, particularly, say, in Southern Europe, huge impacts of crisis on austerity, so cutting of budgets, removing of the state, creating different forms of life. I mean, life that is very tenuous and very hard to endure, even within the borders of Europe. So if we think about it in this more conceptual way, we can say, well, we have all these global crises. We have perhaps a polycrisis or a permacrisis. Generally, of course, we think about how to deal with things politically at a national level or an international level, so governments do that. But if we look at the urban literature, which focuses on urbanization as this global process driven through the economy, but also through social circulation of ideas, culture and things, we're all kind of in a set of circuits when we live in cities, which doesn't necessarily always have something to do with national decision makers. So these are kind of questions that they don't necessarily run through all of the presentations, but the questions I think are prompted by the idea of crisis and polycrisis, things that we have to think about if we're interested in cities. Generally, and as inhabitants of cities or as planning students, we certainly should be. So, how do we get to a democratic policy? Well, I'm assuming, of course, that most people want democratic cities, just cities. Not everyone wants that, and it's important to say that. But assuming that we do, how do we do that when we're in this complex mess, when crisis is poly, multiple, and it is permanent, perhaps? It's at least going to be around for 10 or 15 years. We have to get our head around the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. has gone away from the surface, but has contributed to different forms of crisis and is still impacting through other aspects of the economy. So, how do we make cities more democratic when urbanization and urban life situations are fully entangled with crisis? How do we plan cities where we can't get rid of crisis, where we have to live with crisis? And how do we do that when the urban cities, towns, are already unequal, already very contested, and already disempowered in relation to big global forces of capital or of the nation state? How do we do this if we think about the state? You know, in places like the Netherlands, the state's strong, it's quite a present force, but in lots of parts of the world, the state isn't. It's not necessarily this big sovereign is going to come along and change things for the better. And even if it did, it might not be a friend. So how do we think about, if we think in a global context in particular, how do we think about advancing democracy and social justice when you might not have any more resources than the resources you have around you? So you can't refer to the state. So think in particular the global south now. But the only resources, political or social resources you have are the resources that exist in the context in which you live. And if we think that the state's not necessarily going to be there, what hope urban movements, social movements, or community organisation? Lots of research shows that they can have an impact, certainly a short-term or immediate impact, but it's hard to sustain social movements, urban movements, and community organisation. It takes a lot of work. People have to do a lot of stuff to keep social movements, urban movements going. So they're transient, they don't last forever. And they can be unpredictable, sporadic. So we can't necessarily rely on them. So I don't have answers to any or all of these questions, but I think these are questions that are absolutely confronting us as urbanized people who live in cities, and also planners and policymakers. So one way to start to think about how we might conceptualize a crisis in relation to urban settings is to look, of course, at what people write about cities. And for a good 20, 30 years, we see an emerging literature across the field of urban studies, which is interdisciplinary, planners, sociologists, geographers, some political scientists, all working and all emphasizing the globalized or the planetary nature of urbanization. So there's some kind of idea that there are a range of interconnections between urban places, and these are driven partly through the economy, globalized economy, partly through culture. And if we look at this in this planetary perspective, we start to see different forms of politics and different forms of crisis, and different forms of living. The famous book by Mike Davies, Planet Slums, who wrote about the fact that the majority of the world's population is living in the global south, and that's where the urban population is increasing rapidly, huge megacities developing. The majority of this new urban population are living in slums. And that's growing. That's the growing urban population. People have written about, people like Roger Kyle, German-Canadian geographer, has written about how urbanization is actually really suburbanization. So cities are the form of the city centre. Focused city centre is not really the form which is multiplying and expanding across the world. We're seeing decentralized cities, which have lots of centres. Some of those centres can even be on the periphery. Yeah, and we have scholars of the global south, like Abdul Malik Simone, who write about African cities, Asian cities, in the absence of a sovereign. So in the absence of this force that is going to transform things for the better or the worse. And then they write about how cities are some kind of collective performance, for better or for worse, that cities function through a range of networks which come together and keep producing and reproducing the city. So these are really hard places to transform, places that you can't necessarily come in and plan. Let's get the next one, as I'm going a bit too slowly. Yeah, and against this background, we've seen new forms of theorizing urban politics. So people trying to think about politics not necessarily through nation states and through institutions, but through urban contexts, through urban life situations. So we've had, in recent times, thinking about crisis, in particular the book here, Pandemic Urbanism, which basically showed how pandemics, including COVID, but also SARS before it, emerged and spread through the world, largely through urban channels, through connections which already existed between cities through the world. So rather than thinking about a crisis like a pandemic in national term, from looking down, you see outbursts here and there, their argument was to really understand how a pandemic spreads globally, you need to understand how cities work, how they're connected to each other. And not to miss an opportunity for self-publicity, Philip and I have also argued that you can think about democracy as an idea that can be resituated within cities. So democracy is often thought about in terms of elections and nation states, parliamentary chambers. But democracy is, of course, about the ability to change the world around you. And that could be a way of thinking about how we transform cities. We think about democracy not as something we do once a year at an election, but something we might do ourselves in relation to people around us and the context in which we live in. So these are all this is kind of literature which has been emerging, which is telling us that there are particularly urban ways of thinking about crises. And alongside that, there's a literature that's essentially showing us how cities are essentially not governed by institutions in the state. Even in places like the UK, we have a centralised, strong state. This great book by Roland Atkinson, Alpha City. Alpha is referring to this categorization of global cities, and the kind of the elite category is the alpha category. And that's places like London, New York, Tokyo, those kind of places. And essentially, in this book, he shows how the super rich, because how London was captured by the super rich, basically through buying property, through investing, through transforming urban spaces to their needs and desires, have radically reshaped parts of central London. So we see that, of course, in London. For those of you who know London, through the kind of explosion of kind of gimmicky skyscrapers, and Canary Wharf, those kind of places. So that's kind of a real materialization of capital. You also see it, he argues, in terms of desirable areas where millionaires want to live. Huge areas of Western London lie generally empty because people who buy properties there have 5 or 6 other properties and live in London only in the summer because they don't like the British weather. I don't blame them, but the transformation of those parts of the city has been rapid and has been driven through, not through policy, not through planners, but through capital, through wealth, and through property rights. It's just a brief statistics to show the challenge of how you try to govern these places when you have a massive concentration of international ownership. I mean, some countries are different and stricter, of course, in terms of international ownership. UK is quite lax, unsurprisingly, on those kind of things. So, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about housing because Philip will talk about that. But one very obvious way in which we see a kind of global urban crisis and a crisis occurring through urbanization is the housing crisis, which there's a housing crisis virtually everywhere. We've heard about the student housing crisis in Groningen here, just a second. And we've seen that a much higher level and a much higher increase in prices in other places, as the stat here shows. Yeah.
I noticed, with the exception of Hong Kong, which, I mean, Hong Kong was a British colony as well 20 years ago, I see only Anglophone nations on that list. Is it something, would you say, is a cultural problem, or
No.
What's the cause that Tokyo, for instance, wouldn't be on there?
Well, I think this is the data of 2021. I mean, I think you find this is driven through, I assume, property rights. So where you have the ability to buy property, where that's more common, and there's probably less, or there's more exposure to international investment. So some places have more barriers and protection against international investment, and other places less so. But it's a good point, but it's probably one that is related to regulation and policy frameworks and property rights ultimately. But I suppose the more widespread and concerning point is that you essentially don't have, the only places you don't have a housing crisis now are places where nobody wants to live. Places which are really undesirable and places which are declining and shrinking. You know, I think in the UK context, you think of some of the coastal areas of the UK, some of the northern areas of England, southern parts of Wales, places where there was industry, where there's no industry now, very small economy, people leaving, young people always leaving. There you can find property really easily. The places where there's work, where there is some wealth, there's essentially a housing crisis. Okay, so if we think about this is a range of sort of governance challenges and challenges to democracy. Does then raise the question about what kinds of democracy, or what democracy means in the first case, and what kinds of democracy are possible within urban contexts. I mentioned already that, you know, in liberal democracies, we tend to think of democracy in terms of representation. You elect a government, you elect a member of parliament. Your planning authority is responsible to the parliament. In that sense, there's some democratic control across it. We can argue, I mean, to what extent is politics and democracy allowed to be an actor in the economy? You know, there's a strong argument, the liberal or neoliberal argument that politics should be out of the economy looks after itself better. Can democracy be limited to places? Can you think about democracy in relation to a city like Groningen? You say, right, let's try to make this city even more democratic. Well, does globalization, does the advent of crisis, like a financial crisis, make that a utopian wish when you could be impacted by crisis and you'd have to change policy even without the mandate from the people of the city? I suppose this is a larger question of what can urban democrats, what can urban governments, what can the urban state, what can social movements do when they're faced by so many constraints within their context. So if we think about the challenge, think about this first of all in relation to the state. So if we think about the most sort of political context, the state is this big driver of policy, faces increasing and already massive challenges to govern a city. There are lots of constraints. We mentioned already the challenges that are facing cities, huge challenges of trying to adapt to climate, to mitigate climate challenge. All policy, all planning costs money. Money has to come from somewhere, taxes, usually. There's a huge constraint in terms of what a local government can do. Wealthy city, higher tax rates can, of course, have more money to do and carry out more policy. And if we think in the sort of classical literature, that writes about governing cities, about what the state can do at the urban level. It's a story of constraints. It's not a story necessarily of possibility. It's a literature that emphasizes the difficulty of trying to change things in cities. So we have institutional constraints. Your cities are always part of a wider political system. The nation state can still intervene in cities. Depends on the political system, of course, but the nation state is an actor. What's it going to be like in the Netherlands in the next 5 years with the current government? How will they intervene in places like this city? I understand there's a green left place, a far right coalition. And you have, of course, policy constraints. When you come into power as a radical who wants to change things, there's already a massive institutional context of pre-existing policy and planning regulations. They don't disappear. But what we have seen, to be more positive about things, in recent years, on this kind of attempts to democratize government, a reimagining of the role of the state in relation to urban societies, to the urban population. A classic form of liberal, neoliberal economy has been public-private partnerships. So you have the state taking capital investment in conjunction, in partnership with the private sector to realize particular projects. These have been heavily criticized for the state taking risk and the private sector, the private partner taking the profit, and for the transformations that they have often occurred in terms of services in relation to water, energy, health, other kinds of key social services. And in recent years, we've seen a pushback against that. Not a massive pushback everywhere, but we have some new ideas around public-civic partnerships. The idea that the state makes a partnership with civic organizations. The state tries to develop a new democratic relationship with its citizens through the ownership or running of facilities or infrastructure. Other examples which have been ambivalent in some of their impacts, but have certainly been very prevalent, are the idea of participatory budgeting, that you allow a population or a community to be involved in how money is spent. So the state has some money, it asks, in relation to certain amounts of that money, it asks the citizens how they would like that money to be spent. And we think of, this is in Germany here, in Wolfhagen, this is a famous example of a remunicipalization. So privatized company, energy companies were then remunicipalized, taken back to the local municipality, and at the same time democratized. So they didn't just take them back to the state, they kind of included citizens groups. So tried to make energy and the energy transition, renewable energies, a question of democracy, a question of participation. And these are all ways in which the state has been rethought. So these are plugged into lots of different debates that some of you might have heard of. There's the idea of a new municipalism in relation to places like Barcelona, Preston, where you had specific attempts by leftish governments or left of centre and left governments trying to develop new ways of relating the state and the citizenry together. So there has been a real movement in relation to thinking about how we can make cities more democratic and more robust to deal with these crises. So if we think about all the crises, the polycrisis that we're facing, one of the issues that one of the key dimensions of crisis which seems to be impeding us is the political dimension. No, of course we can solve the climate crisis, but if we can't have a genuine political discussion about the impacts of crisis, we have absolutely no possibility to have any agency in relation to those forms of crisis anyway. So it seems like dealing with the democratic part of it, the political part of it, is the absolutely first essential part of dealing with the other aspects of crisis. So, 32 minutes. So, I suppose, how long was I meant to speak for? About 32 minutes, probably, was it?
35.
35, okay. Okay, let's see how that works. I thought I had a little bit longer, but I'll do my best.
We started late.
Sorry?
I started late.
I started a bit late, okay, so I've got 2 minutes
After
extra,
work.
okay.
2 minutes after work.
Okay. Well, I suppose, is it helpful to go through this part? Do you think?
Oh, could be helpful.
It'll be helpful, thanks for your sharing. We're like a double act, you know, we sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so anyway, I lost my thread a little bit. So alongside these ideas of the potential of sort of democratizing government, I should have said very briefly here, some of you might have heard of this idea of this model, the Preston model of community wealth building. This is an idea of trying to build regional urban economies where you create positive inflows of investment. So you get big institutions like universities and hospitals to buy goods and services and employ from the region. And you use these institutions to create positive benefits for smaller businesses in quite poor areas like these two places. So all of this is community wealth building, public partnerships, are ideas that focus quite a lot on institutions and the state. But if we think about, you know, the place where we were this morning, and some of the ideas that was it Paul? Was that the guy who was talking to us? It was Paul, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, he wasn't talking necessarily specifically about a massive political movement, although he was in a way talking about political change and real change. We might interpret the way he was talking about that space and the city as thinking about it as a space of possibility. You know, that's what he was talking about, wasn't it? That's what he wanted to realize in that little part of this big development. That it was there was an opportunity he wanted to create the opportunity for people to come together to be creative, to create alternatives. And that's the way that a lot of people think about cities anyway. And a lot of people argue then that cities have a kind of creative energy and citizens have a potentiality to do lots of things, indeed are doing quite a lot of things, if they're given the opportunity and the resources to do so. So this idea of the city also links us back to some of the issues which create politics in the city, create opportunities for change, but also create difficulties and contestations. So in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a massive increase in urban movements and events. And this idea of using the city as a stake in politics. So that activists think about big issues in relation to the areas or the cities around them. So the urban becomes a kind of signifier, or the city becomes a signifier, say for climate change or crisis or inequality, as it did, say, in the Occupy period, not long after the financial crisis, where activists occupied parts of financial centres and made this case about global inequalities and the links between different financial problems and the inequality across the planet. So we also see cities become important as a stage for ideas. Of course, that's where a lot of people live. There are centres. Big cities in particular become spaces where people go and demand democracy. It's not necessarily always in relation just to a city. The city performs this kind of function. It has another political potential in that sense. Alongside that, you really do see the political becoming urbanized. We have ideas of belonging and the right to stay as a political idea, of the right to not be evicted, so again related to housing, and the right to a good urban life as being a kind of way of organising a wider movement. Okay. So I think my 35 minutes are pretty close to being up. But what I wanted to leave you with was, if we're thinking about how we get beyond a crisis and what role democracy and politics might have in that, we see, of course, that we need the state. We need all the resources that we can get to deal with polycrisis. But we also probably need to rethink our own relationship to democracy, or what we think democracy might be. And one definition of that, which I quite like, and it's a bit different from, it doesn't exclude representative democracy, but it's a different way of thinking about it. It foregrounds different ideas. It's from an American political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, who said that, in my understanding, democracy is a project. So it's a project. It's already not an institution. It's something that you do, something you get involved with. Concerned with the political potentialities of ordinary citizens. That is, with their possibilities of becoming political beings. Through the self-discovery of common concerns and of modes of action for realising them. So what he's talking about in a very simple way is that democracy, the original idea of democracy, and one that we might want to return to as we think about the challenges facing us, is something that we need to confront together. And we need to build forms of common concerns, so public concern, and forms of collective action. And I think that was similar to what Paul was talking about in relation to, I think it was a Dutch planner or something, who was talking about we need to go back to community. I'm a bit skeptical, worried about the term community sometimes, because it includes exclusions as well as inclusions. But it's a similar idea that if you want to rethink and really re-energize politics, perhaps then you need to go back to basics and sort of remember what democracy was about, why people are engaged with democracy, why people have fought for democracy, and tried to aspire to democracy through history. So I think I wanted to leave you with that idea, and a certain urban way of thinking about it would be to then say that, how do you come together? What kind of things do you do? Well, you might sort of think about reshaping urban space. You know, democracy might be then about, how do we change the space around us? How is the space made? What forces develop this space, make it the space that it is? We might sort of thinking about, how can we create new systems of need and care alongside the systems we already have? How can we create an urban environment in which people have access to the resources that they need? And we might also think about what kind of institutions that would involve. How do we build institutions which are outside of the state and embedded in our everyday lives, that might connect us to other people, and might connect us to ideas of having belonging and ownership for our cities? And I think I'll stop there because I've gone over time. Thank you very much. So it's time for